Now we're going to bring in Tim Robertson, who is going to be our speaker for this evening. He's an Ifmga guide and is going to be talking to us all about the weird, wonderful, and certainly cold sport of ice climbing. So, Tim, we'll invite you to take it away. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chaz. Hello from Wanaka. I'm going to start with looking at boots and crampons, because really wearing all the spiky stuff is the most fun part of ice climbing for me. And crampon work and footwork is really the foundation of good ice climbing. So a temptation when you're getting into ice climbing is to get a summer boot and simply stick a really aggressive crampon on it. So I have an example here of quite a nice summer boot with some flex in the front, paired with a really aggressive ice climbing crampon. And unfortunately, what happens when you do this is the crampon tends to overpower the boot itself and then starts to sort of part way. And even though it's fitted on nice and tight, you get sort of flex. And now I can get my fingers in under the boot. So what that means on the ice is you're kicking into the ice, your boot moves around a bit in the holster or the harness of the crampon, and you lack that really good connection with your foot and your skeleton to the front points of the crampons. Okay, so we'll go on to my second example, which is an improvement. So this is my probably my favourite pair of ice climbing boots. They've got a full rigid shank. They're really durable for New Zealand conditions, and they're warm enough for sort of single day trips or trips out of huts if you can dry them out. And I've got the same crampon fitted to these. So if I try and do the same test, which is perhaps somewhat unrealistic, but gives you an idea, there's very little movement with the toe of the crampon. So as I'm kicking that into the ice, I've got a really good connection between the front points and my heel. However, this setup's still not perfect, because in order to make this crampon comfortable to walk a long distance, they've reduced the length of the front points and the secondary points, so it's more comfortable for walking. So unless you've got really good technique, you can end up kicking the ice with your toe before you engage the secondary points. Okay, so if you're really keen on ice climbing, or you've got plenty of money to invest in it, the ideal setup is something like this with the adjustable toe bail. Okay, so the toe bail on this has 3 different positions, and what that means is that I can adjust how far forward the secondary points come, and you'll see that the secondary points come a lot further out of the front of the boot. Okay, so when I kick my foot in, I can almost rest on my secondary points before the toe of the boot engages. And although it's a really big, bulky boot, this is a double boot, a Spantic, I've got a really good connection with my foot through the boot and into the crampon, and I can climb ice better on those than I can on the first boot. Okay. The only advantage of having a really big boot is because it's a double boot. If I was camping, I would be able to dry them out. Okay. So think about that. If you're getting your crampon set up for ice climbing, that'll really help you out with your footwork. Okay. And the other really important thing is your ice tools. Okay, so most people would associate ice climbing ice tools with something like this, a really aggressive doubled handled ice tool. They definitely make things a lot easier. You know, they've got really sharp picks and you're able to match hands on them. But when I started climbing, I didn't actually have ice axes as good as what is quite a standard general mountaineering tool these days. So this has got a slight bend at the top. And so that means it sits and hangs really well on steep ice. Now this one, you have to use a leash, and that has quite a lot of controversy around it, whether to use leashes or not. The biggest problem I find with leashes is it really stops you getting a nice natural swing when you're using a tool. So I'll try and demonstrate that on the next example. The major bonus, of course, is a leash is that you can't drop your ice axe. Okay. And this leash comes off relatively easily if you've got it sticking in the ice. Okay. So as things have developed, now we have sort of more generalist type ice tools that actually work really well ice climbing. So an example would be this thing here. Okay. So I've adapted slightly. So it's got a slight curve. It has the pick of a modern ice climbing tool. Okay, really sharp pick. And it has these little handles that you can slide down. And that gives you a really nice grip. Now, if you buy an extra handle, you can then have one that you can match on. Okay. And the major advantage for those, for me, is that you can get a really nice swing going. So I'll demonstrate that. So most people, when they hold an ice axe, hold it really tight the whole time when they're swinging it, okay, which actually locks up the muscles in your hand. Whereas if you can change your grip slightly, so you've either got the thumb along the spine of the ice axe or actually completely open, I can drop the ice axe up and down in my hand like this, which is very similar to what I do when I'm swinging the ice axe. So once I've got the ice axe placed, I can then change my grip round to a really tight, secure grip that I can pull on, okay? Whereas I can't actually hold it that tight and swing it as easily. Okay, so if you're going to go out and purchase some new tools for the winter, if it's an additional set from your general mountaineering crampon, ice tools, maybe you should consider buying a crossover set. And the advantage of that is that if you learn to climb steep technical ice, you're using then the same set when you go off into the mountains. So if your end goal is to climb technical routes in the high Alps, you're going to be learning to climb on the same tools that on technical ice down low, perhaps, that you're then taking up onto the high mountains. Okay, so getting back to leashes. So the other alternative of leashes is having an umbilical, which is a setup like this. Okay, which then connects to the tool, okay, and means that if I drop the tool or fall off, I retain the tool, okay, and you can see that's elasticated. The disadvantage of that is if I fall off, okay, I'm potentially going to get hit by the tool when the elastic comes tight, okay, or I could actually fall onto my tools and onto this device, which I don't want to be doing. So the other disadvantage is, like leashes, you can end up with them wrapped around everywhere. So there's no real perfect solution. In some ways, it's a lot simpler not to have leashes at all. But then obviously, if you're somewhere where the climbing is difficult and you drop one of your ice axes, then you're in a spot of bother. Okay, so if you've got any questions about that sort of stuff, crampons or ice axe, we're going to have a bit of a question and answer session at the end. So if we think about ice routes in general, and how ice forms, almost always we're actually in an avalanche path, because the water drains down features and oversteep terrain and then goes through freeze-thaw cycles. So it's a relatively insecure pastime, because even if you're climbing on a well-formed ice route, eventually it's going to fall down. So we'll get onto that in a bit more in depth later. Getting back to our equipment, it's really important if we're in that environment where we're going through repeated freeze-thaw cycles, we acknowledge that there's a lot of water around, and that can play havoc with some of the materials that we use when we're out climbing. So your typical sport climbing quick jaws made out of nylon, once they're frozen, really become quite weakened. And so it's worth having materials such as Dyneema or Spectra that retain strength when they're frozen. And they often retain their usability when they're frozen up as well. So that's definitely the way to go. And then with ropes, the same applies. So I've got a nice new rope here. It's got a really good dry coating on it. So it's nice and slippery. Okay. And that will help. It won't soak up water. It'll be resistant to freezing. And that generally will make it easier to handle. The other property we want when we're ice climbing is something with a really low impact force. And so one solution to deal with that is to use 2 half ropes and then clip alternate pieces of protection. Or if you're looking at a single rope, they tend to be the skinnier single ropes. So that brings with it some own challenges with that they're extremely stretchy. So if you've set up a top rope with your low impact force single rope, bear in mind as people start off the ground or off ledges, you might get 3 or 4 meters of stretch. So you really need to pull that rope in tight if you want it to behave like your normal cragging rope. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, if the ice route we're going to climb eventually is going to fall down, what could be clues that it's going to fall down today or maybe tomorrow? And so research has shown that rapid temperature change, so more than 10 degrees of temperature change within 24 hours, is often a precursor to large catastrophic collapses. And a lot of people think that in just terms of thaw, but actually when ice hangs down, and even if it is supported from the bottom, if it cools down more than 10 degrees within 24 hours and stays cold, often it becomes really, really brittle. And if we come along with our lovely technical ice axe and impact it, we can shatter the bonds between the pillars and actually collapse the ice. So if you're a really motivated ice climber, somebody like Lionel Clay perhaps, then you're going to be obsessively watching the freezing level, because although you might get a sudden drop in temperature and you might think that's perfect for ice, the ice might be quite brittle. Really waterlogged or blue ice is usually the most stable. So if you're seeing really, really nice water-soaked ice, that is the most plastic and the most stable. When the ice is transparent or really brittle, then that's usually the most vulnerable. So that's another sign. Another typical trend that is quite unhelpful is if the temperature peaks over 2 degrees centigrade for a really long period of time, or it's combined with sun or warm wind. If you've ever been in Y Creek, when it's 3 or 4 degrees with the nor'wester blowing, what happens is all the icicles that are stuck on slabs, the bond on the slab melts out and the daggers drop off. And that's a real hazard because ice weighs roughly about 900 kilos per cubic metre. So essentially it's the same weight as water. So you've got tons and tons of ice falling down potentially down around you. So getting back to the freeze-thaw cycle, so what I find in the ice climbing environment is we've got to really gear our clothing towards that. So typically I would be wearing a Gore-Tex jacket, Gore-Tex pants, and instead of having a downy, I will have more synthetic type jackets. So I've got my big synthetic belay jacket that I would then put over the top of everything on the belay. Oh dear, there goes some tears. And then the drips can rain down on me and I can shelter in my warm jacket, and then I can take it off when I'm ready to climb again. Okay. And start climbing, stuff it in my pack, and the second time I pull it out of my pack, it still functions. Whereas a down jacket, once you've stuffed it into your backpack when it's wet and pulled it out, the second time it stops functioning. Okay, so that leads us on to sort of strategy for leading climbs. So what's the most important thing to remember about ice climbing? For me, it's that you can't fall. If you fall, you're probably going to break your ankle. You've got crampons on your feet. If they hit the ice, they're going to stop. The gear can be unreliable, and we often run it out or are forced to run it out because of the quality of the ice a lot more than you would when you're sport climbing. And unless you're climbing in the really, really high grades, there are often terraces. So unless you're climbing a water ice 5 or 6 route, you've probably got terraces below you. So you really don't want to fall when you're ice climbing. So then you'd say, well, how do you avoid falling? And for me, I guess avoiding falling is climbing on with your limits, but also trying to be really efficient with placing equipment so that if I am getting gripped or scared, I can plug in equipment, so plug in a screw and get some protection and be able to rest. Okay, so an important skill with that is then how to rack our screws, and that becomes challenging when we've got gloves on. So what I use is I buy some of these relatively inexpensive black diamond ice clippers, which using gloves, I can take a screw on and off and place it. Or if I'm seconding, I can take it out of the ice, get all the ice out of it, okay, and re-rack it, okay. Now, they work quite well, but different brands tend to like hanging out together. So, for example, I have my black diamond ones on the front and my pencil screws on the back, okay. And that way I can grab a certain length or a certain type when I want, and it keeps it all nice and tidy so that I can also grab out a quick draw or an extender if I need one, okay. So to make that easier, I tend to climb with a spinner, the thinnest gloves I can for the temperature. But it is a cold environment, so I might end up climbing in a mid-weight glove if I have to. And then it's a matter of being practiced at being able to take the screws on and off and place them or access quick draws with big gloves on. Generally, I save my biggest gloves or mitts until I'm belaying. However, occasionally, if it's somewhere like Canada or a brutally cold Alpine route, you'll have to do the same. So again, with the system, I've got the cleanliness, the tidiness that I can find what I need. Okay. So typically, where do you want to place screws? Well, I want to place screws where the ice is best. So if I can, that's on the crux. Okay. And I want to try and avoid climbing, trying to race through the steeper ground when I'm getting pumped, skipping placing screws to try and then arrive at rests. Now, it depends on the terrain you're climbing. If it's a rest where you can be bridging, that'd work well. But if it's on terraces or ledges, what you can find is that as you top out onto the terrace, you've got a flat terrace with steeper terrain above, and the flat terrace has had snow land on it, or possibly is holding tension because of the shape of it. And when you come along with your ice axe and you hit it, you get a lot more dinner plating because of that shape. And so if you've raced away from your protection towards the terrace, it's quite common to be horrified to find that the worst ice you encounter on the whole route is on that transition from steep to the terrace. So I'd really encourage you to be strategic with your ice screws and to really protect any sections before the terrace, as well as thinking, okay, I'll be able to get up there onto a terrace and place a screw. And remember, don't fall. So one way to ensure that you don't fall, if you're trying to progress through the grades, is make sure that you're leading relatively easy routes for you, but try and find somebody else to lead harder routes so that you can second them. So top rope will second hard routes and lead relatively easy ones. Okay, so if you arrive at the top, you might be thinking, well, you know, what are some tips and tricks for getting down? So I'll retrieve my gear. So I always carry on the back of my harness a long screw, a knife, and a V-threader. Okay, and this is my favourite V-threader. It's nice and long. It's bendy. I can put slings around icicles. There are other brands such as this, which have an inbuilt knife in here and a hook. Okay, this one you can also force the ice out of ice screws if you've forgotten to clean them out. Hopefully you never do that. But anyway, that's another type. And then I'll have, a length of sling or cord that then is pre-prepared at a logical length to build a V-thread. Okay, and that way I can create an anchor and get myself down. Okay, so what other stuff would I take with me? Well, I have my belay device, similar to I'd use on multi-pitch rock routes. I'd have some anchor equipment, okay, and I'd have some prussets, okay. A similar sort of equipment that you take on any multi-pitch or alpine route so that you can do rope rescues or protect an abseil. You could, for a V-threader, create them out of a coat hanger. This is a quite popular thing to do, but beware if you get into real cold temperatures, like I was in Canada. When you take out your V-threader made out of a coat hanger and unfold it, the metal becomes brittle and they tend to snap in half. Okay. So with all of our sharps, so your ice axes, your crampons, your ice screws, it's really important that you keep them sharp. That will make your life easier when you're on lead. And so a piece of equipment that I don't see a lot in New Zealand, but I really like, is an ice screw sharpener. So this device here, you can buy from Petzl, and what you do is once your ice screw loses its teeth and they dull, we can insert that into our sharpener and sharpen them up. Obviously, you've got to do each one and each side, and it restores them back, maybe not quite like new, but back to sharp. And that way it'll, if you've bottomed them out into rock or just used them a lot, even in ice, they go blunt, can restore them so that they're really nice and crisp and sharp, and you can get good gear quickly. So, planning ice routes. So how do you go about planning where to climb water ice in New Zealand? Well, I guess it goes back to what we said in the beginning, is that you need to be aware that ice routes are almost always in an avalanche path. Now, you might have done a backcountry avalanche awareness course, and you might have been thinking, well, okay, I'll solve that by bringing my transceiver, okay, my probe, and my shovel along, okay? Now, that's not necessarily a stupid idea. If you've got avalanche danger on the approach to a climb, that could be really useful. But if the route itself or the descent from the route is threatened with avalanche hazard, or you could potentially trigger an avalanche, then typically you're not going to be killed by suffocation, by being buried in an avalanche. You're going to go off a cliff with the snow. And statistically in New Zealand, climbers are more likely to be killed in avalanches than skiers. So if you're going out and planning to go ice climbing, you should be looking at the backcountry avalanche advisory, and you should be switching your brain on to whether you're going to be exposed to avalanche hazard. And that includes the approach, the route itself, and the descent. And then what is the trend? You know, is it going to get really hot later in the day? Is it going to snow lots? Where you're going while you're there? You want to be thinking about these things. Okay. The second and really significant hazard we have ice climbing compared to other types of climbing is falling ice. And again, you might say, oh, well, I've got my nice shiny helmet. That'll help me. And it might for small pieces of ice, but really you're going to need your belay, and you're going to be thinking about the position your belay is in. You're going to need to be thinking about possibly where the other people are. So if there are people on the route ahead of you, it's probably not suitable to be climbing that route, because your helmet itself is probably not going to be enough to mitigate the danger from several hundred kilos of ice falling down a route. So I wrote a bit of a blog on my website with some links that you could have a look at, and there's a really good one from a code of behaviour for ice climbing. So you can check that out. It's usual courteous common sense, but there are some things to consider if you're going out on weekends and routes are busy. So what kind of emergency equipment should we take then if things don't go wrong or don't go well? So I would always have with me my first aid kit, okay? And as Jazz mentioned, it's a cold activity, so I would have some sort of bivvy bag or bothy bag for the group, because if you have a problem on the route or if somebody is injured, then you may well freeze to death before rescue can get to you if the weather's bad or you don't have cell phone coverage. Going with that, a PLB or some sort of emergency equipment, communication equipment would be good. One of my favourites to avoid epics is the thermos, okay? By carrying a thermos, I have access to heat and warmth, and when filled with something yummy like blackcurrant juice, there's pretty amazing how warm you'll become again after doing a cup full of hot blackcurrant. Some sugary drink will really get your circulation going. Okay, so it's worth thinking about that kind of equipment. On belays, hand warmers are especially useful, or you could even have some body warmers in case of emergency. And remembering that the days are short, so having a head torch with you. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that I'd regularly take and be hoping not to use. I may well be taking avalanche equipment, depending on the avalanche hazard that I'm expecting, and I go out with an open mind. So I might have my objective in mind, but I always have a plan B or a plan C, hopefully in my head, to do instead if I don't see the conditions I want on those routes. So we'll just go through some examples that we might find in the Queenstown Ice and Boulders guidebook, and I guess it's the ice section that we're really interested in. So 3 examples from the Remarkables, which are quite contrasting. The first one would be the Alta Ice. So the Alta Ice is quite unusual in New Zealand in that it faces the sun. So it's north facing. It also has potential avalanche danger on the approach. You're walking up part of the Grand Couloir, which faces the sun. And there's a lot of terrain above it that's snow covered. So, I'd be definitely considering taking avalanche equipment with me, and usually do on those routes. But if you're in a thaw cycle, then that's going to be a really bad place to be, or on a hot sunny day. So if we contrast that to another really popular area near the Remarkables, which would be Wye Creek. So Wye Creek is very shady. The terrain above the routes is really unusual because it's quite flat. So there's relatively low avalanche danger on most of the routes there. But however, you have a lot of hanging ice features, big daggers, giant icicles, and so you've really got to be aware of the icefall hazard climbing in at Wye Creek. That's it, that you may have no or limited avalanche danger, but the icefall hazard's really, really got to be considered if you've got some of those temperature scenarios that I talked about earlier. And the last example would be the west face of the Remarkables. So obviously it's a west face. It'll tend to get sun in the evening. So if you're having somewhat of an epic on a mixed route, you may get rime or snow melting and coming down the routes at the end of the day. But generally there's less hazard from above than, say, somewhere like the Lake Alta ice. The descent's relatively straightforward, but the approach has some real significant avalanche hazard. And this is the exact type of avalanche hazard where our shovel isn't going to solve the problem. We're traversing along terraces. if we get avalanched off the terraces, we're down into steeper terrain. And so you might want to consider, if you're going there and you're unsure, having an open mind that maybe you could belay some sections, or that you might not be able to get to the objective that you want if there's been a lot of new snow or wind transported snow, or that the avalanche danger is unmanageable. So those are 3 different, quite contrasting areas, all contained in this book. There's a lot more climbing in there as well. We won't go into everything. So I guess to finish off, I'd encourage people to try and track down a mentor for ice climbing if you're really serious about improving your ice climbing, somebody who can lead things that you find hard and you can second them. It'd be also really good to get some instruction from an NZMGA guide who's passionate about ice climbing. That will definitely help you speed up your progression through the grades, or be able to climb a lot safer. If you like books, probably the best resource these days is Ice and Mixed Climbing, Modern Techniques, and that's by Will Gadd. It's published by the Mountaineers, and that has excellent sections on how ice actually forms and what to look for when you're placing protection, and a whole lot of stuff on movement. And as I said, there's also, I'll put this blog on, which has links to pretty much everything I've talked about, which I've really gleaned from a lot of different sources. So I'll post a link to that in the comments. Okay, so with the magic of modern technology, I soon should be all these Jazz.
G'day. Thanks very much, Tim. That's been an outstanding and pretty detailed introduction into basically the kind of cutting edge of ice climbing techniques. So I think hopefully anyone from a complete beginner through to an experienced climber has probably gained a few tricks from that. So thanks very much. I'm going to run through some questions. We've had a few audience questions. We've had a few comments as well. So thanks very much. And how good the talk was. So cheers for that. We'll start off with the first question we've got from the audience, which goes back right to the start, of course, of the talk. And it's around some of those techniques that you started with. So things like kicking into the ice and the importance of that, and you know, swinging your ice axe and that kind of thing. The question's from Nina, and she is kind of wanting to get an idea of what the wrist flick that you mentioned is. Like, that's quite a, you know, that whole flick of the tool is something that comes with time. And she's saying, is it a bit like maybe skimming stones across water? Do you want to describe that, how it feels maybe?
Yeah, good question. So I guess when you get a good placement, it feels like you're holding a dart that hits a dartboard, and that you can feel a vibration through the ice tool. It has a bit of a tremor. And if you are swinging and you get a poor placement, it really feels like a dull thwack, like maybe you've missed the ice and hit the snow next to it, even though you've actually hit the ice itself. And that's often because the ice is split, or perhaps it's a piece of poor quality ice. I guess really looking at the way you hold the ice axe, and so that you're holding it like you might hammer in a nail, okay, rather than hold on to a bar to do a pull-up. That kind of difference.
Yeah, no, good explanation. I think it is something that's a bit hard to explain over the video. You just kind of try it out, eh? Joseph asks what specific ice climbing training you do, or if, you know, general mountain guiding fitness is good enough. I mean, I remember, like, and anyone watching in Dunedin might know about some pine trees up near Ross Creek that take a hammering. Trees are all right. What do you do to keep fit?
Oh, I try and get out and rock climb as much as I I can. I find rock climbing fitness relates really well to ice climbing fitness. I think if you don't have access to rock or ice, then doing pull-ups or dead hangs using the tools that you're going to climb with. But I'm not really an authority on training. But I think if you delved onto the internet, people like Will Gadd and stuff would have mountains of recommendations. They're obviously extremely strong people.
Yeah, fair enough. Hey, sticking with the gear theme, I couldn't help but notice. Actually, I was pretty surprised when you stood up and you're wearing a harness and a rack of ice screws. But one of the things you demonstrated was the old clearing the ice out of the ice screw. I think anyone watching who's climbed ice will know how important it is to do that, because otherwise your screw's useless for the next pitch, really. But you blew on the screw, I noticed. And do you want to just maybe talk about when it's appropriate to blow on the ice screw and when it's not?
Yeah, I guess Jazz has probably been to Canada, and as a New Zealander, which I was, so you can blow ice out of ice screws, but just put a glove on. You've got to be really careful that you don't actually stick the ice screw onto any part of your mouth. And so you can put the ice screw in the glove and kind of make a bit of a tunnel and blow the ice out, or you can do it the other way around with the screw. But if you're used to New Zealand temperatures and then you're in Canada and you stick the ice screw to your lips, then it'll be a bit of a bloodbath, unfortunately.
Yeah, certainly will. The other option as well is not quite as elegant, but you're just tapping the screw often against the head of your tool, not with the teeth end and upside down. It's pretty key.
Yeah, so doing something like that rather than whacking the threads or the teeth. Yeah, and often a combination of both works. The tapping will free it up and the hot air will kind of blow it out.
Yeah, no, that's good. Probably good to clarify that before we get a bunch of people like suing us for their plastic surgery lip reconstructions. Nina asks about suggestions for other good places in New Zealand to ice climb. Obviously, Waikreek's kind of the classic, but what are some other ideas?
Yeah, there's definitely stuff on the North Island, at Te Kino or on the Pinnacles. The stuff on the Pinnacles is, more like Alpine routes in some ways, because you usually don't reverse down the routes. And in Canterbury, Bush Stream is quite a popular venue, but that's kind of got a lot more of an Alpine feel as well than somewhere like Waikreek. And it's probably better, Bush Stream's better earlier in the season, because you don't want too much snow. It's that big classic Canterbury ski slope terrain.
Yep. No, fair point. Hey, that probably gets into Tom Harris's question about he's after some specific tips on ice climbing the North Island volcanoes. I don't know what he means really by specific tips for the volcanoes themselves. Like maybe is the ice up there any different, or is it just like you've said about how you kind of don't really, top rope, or you kind of got to carry on to the top?
Well, I think the central North Island and the North Island volcanoes are a great place to learn ice technique. My top tip would be make sure your crampons are sharp. There was a South Islander once going to Whakapapa and noticing my crampons drift down the ice and just leaving scratches behind them because they weren't sharp enough. And I think really, these days with forums and trying to network with people and really put your mind into the mountains is the way to try and improve your ability to track down venues and locations. Every different season, some locations are better than others. I guess there's a classic pillar that's relatively accessible in Tura, and some features at Te Kino which are relatively accessible, but whether they're regularly forming with the winters up there, I'm not sure.
All right. Daniel asks for any tips on building, snow anchors and bollard anchors. So you get to the top of your ice route, and maybe you get beyond the steep part, and then you're trying to build a belay, but actually everything's turned to snow. What are your thoughts there? Or maybe it's not a belay so much as abseiling. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, then bollards are quite interesting in winter. If you've got a layered snowpack, you've got to be quite careful that you have a consolidated layer, that you're not just creating a shear in the snowpack with your rope. Possibly belaying at the top, so taking a snow stake with you and doing something like a T-slot and bringing your second up might be better than trying to descend off a bollard if the snow's not suitable. In the North Island, the snow is really, really compact often, and you might be able to get something like an upright top clip snow stake at the top of the route if you have enough snow. So it's a little bit hard to say without the snow sort of in front of us, as an example.
Sometimes it's just digging, you transition and you think you've got onto a snow slope, but really there's that, ice is still under there. It's just the, frozen stream bed or whatever the source of the ice is. Sometimes just digging is good.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I guess if it's in lean conditions, having some rock gear and then having the same principle that you can dig down to some solid rock and underneath the mushy snow or something might be a good option too.
Yeah. No, good thought. And sticking with pro, Tom asks, what do you think about placing ice screws in pre-existing holes?
Oh, that's a great question. So there's been some research done on that, and the results of that research was that they thought if that screw has been placed in the best possible ice, then you're probably best just plugging another screw straight into that hole, which sounds quite counterintuitive, but the test that they did said that each screw thread cut a new sort of pattern into the hole, and that was stronger than plugging a screw in within a sort of 30 centimetre radius of that original piece of ice. So I was quite surprised by that research. I guess if the hole looks short, perhaps you could try a longer screw, or you might be able to clean the surface of the ice off, and if it's deep ice, and try and get further into the back. But they were actually quite surprising results. The screws placed in old holes were actually pretty much as strong as you'd expect from any screw.
Yeah, I remember that as well. And obviously, that's assuming there hasn't been like major temperature change or, it's melted out. But I've certainly come across, pretty fresh pre-existing holes, and there might not be an option nearby, and you take them, and as long as it's got a bit of bite going in, you take it, eh? So,
yeah, well, I think people, as you say, people often see the best piece of ice and place the screw in an optimal point, and then I guess if you're worried about it, if you could find another screw nearby, maybe using that as well. But yeah, it's definitely an issue if you're in places like Canada where there's a bit more traffic.
Yep, definitely seen some Swiss cheese on a few classic routes, and just kind of like pick the best looking one and hope that it's still good. I really thought your description of the importance of placing ice screws before like a bulge or a transition in the slope was really important, a really good point. I think that was definitely something that is the bane of any climber, when you get to those transitions and the ice turns pretty lousy. The other thing I thought of when you were explaining that was around, you've got a bit of a curve, and you're trying to front point into it, and when it's vertical, the front points, it's all good, like they're going in, but then as soon as it's curving, they're like coming down and they can skate out. And I thought that was another reason for that. Do you have any thoughts on like footwork through those transitions?
Yeah, sometimes it's almost like a mantle, isn't it? Like you sort of I guess the temptation is to keep moving your ice tools further forward onto the terrace, and you can end up sort of, I guess, like you are on a tricky spot at Castle Hill on a boulder problem, where you've got your hands on the top and your stomach on the lip, and then you can't kick your crampons in anymore. And so really keeping yourself quite bunched up, and your legs really bent, because once your legs are straight, you can't really swing them.
Yeah. Good. Just and a good reason again to put in an ice screw before an easy bit, or before what seems like it's going to be an easy bit. So Tom also asks a bit of a controversial question: if you do fall, is there a safe way to do so, such as keeping your crampons away from the ice or the wall?
I guess I haven't had a lot of experience falling on ice. I guess you'd really just want to try and do it on the steepest terrain as possible. When you're falling, you've really lost composure and control. Historically, with the leashes, what was interesting is sometimes your feet would cut out and you'd actually end up hanging on your leashes. When I first started ice climbing, we only had leash tools, and that became problematic as people transferred onto mixed terrain and really steep mixed terrain. So I think in some ways with hard mixed routes, if you're on steep terrain, being able to let your ice axe go is quite good. On pure ice routes, no. I guess ideally being on top rope would be the best way to fall.
I think just don't, right? Like it's not cool. It's poor style. Like it's not like you're not trying to push grades in the way that you might, on a sport climb or whatever, right? Like the consequences are just too high to be putting yourself in that position where you've just, like you say, lost composure. So no, I kind of agree with you on that. But then we get some more questions kind of on the topic of assuming a fall, or maybe just sticking with the gear theme. Joseph asks, what do you think about screamers, and do you use them?
I think screamers definitely have their pace. Unfortunately, they're relatively expensive, which puts them out of the kind of accessible category for a lot of people. They definitely work. I know of cases of people.
Explain what one is.
Oh, good question. So a screamer is instead of a normal quick draw, it has a whole lot more slings sewn sort of semi-securely together, and when you fall, the whole thing elongates out to maybe a metre, and that elongation, similar to, say, a Via Ferrata kit, absorbs a lot of the impact. So I think, if you're a dedicated ice climber, a few screamers on your quick draw rack would be definitely a good thing to have. But they are also a one-hit wonder. So I guess, it comes back to that not falling, but perhaps you've got yourself committed to a place where your gear is not as good as you like, and that could improve your composure, knowing that screamer will increase the chance of that screw holding.
Yep. Yeah, no, I tend to have one or two for that kind of reason, and also for multi-pitch abseil descents as well. They're quite useful for that. So what lengths of ice screws, someone would like to know, would you take for a climbing trip somewhere like Wye Creek?
Good question. So I've definitely got one nice long 22 centimetre screw, which I have for my V-threads and anchors. And then typically 19s are a good length. So, maybe I'd take, say, 8 19 centimetre screws, and maybe 2 22 centimetre screws, and maybe 2 17s, or a 17 and a 15. And that would be if I was going to climb something that was really fat. a really well-formed root. If I was looking at something that was maybe thinner, I'd add a few more of the smaller sizes, because generally it's not that practical to tie off ice screws. It's quite good in theory, but they've shown actually if the ice screw's sort of sticking out maybe up to 2 or 3 centimetres, that's actually still better to clip the end of the screw than to try and tie it off. And if you've got cold hands and you've ever tried to play with a Spectra sling, sort of, my calves usually don't have quite the endurance that my dexterity gives me.
Yeah, no, that's right. So just looking through the other questions, a really important one from Simon at Unwin, or is it Pip? Hi, Simon and Pip. Anyway, what they want to know what you do about peeing and pooing when you're ice climbing.
Good question. So, if you're going to popular venues, then at least it's winter, so you can kind of crap in a cornstarch bag and it'll freeze, and that actually makes transporting out human waste a lot easier than in the summer. So, having a cornstarch bag and maybe a dry bag or a heavy-duty plastic bag that you can use, peeing on ice routes, I guess we've probably all had to do it, but ideally on a multi-pitch route, that is, but trying to sort of keep it out of the way from the main trafficked areas if you can, rather than the base of the classic. It might sort of degrade the experience for the next person.
Yeah, good point. I note that you went straight to carrying out your poo, which is spot on. Like, it's none of this under a rock business of old. I think that's now becoming a popular enough sport, and obviously we now know a lot more about how long the stuff takes to break down. That I think that's pretty important, especially for White Creek.
Yeah. Well, I've drunk a lot of the water in White Creek. I'd like to for it to remain good quality.
Yeah, amen. Fletcher asks, what's the best way to protect aerated rime ice routes such as the Mount Taranaki summit area?
Oh, good question. I guess the first strategy would be digging. And hopefully that if you can dig down to older layers of rime ice where there's been a freeze thaw cycle, you might actually get some stuff that's consolidated. I think it's a really challenging medium because sometimes the rime's formed really quickly, and as you said, it's quite aerated. People have talked about and experimented with shorter snow stakes. I read something about Will Gadd trying to climb a big waterfall in the United States. Niagara. No, it was Niagara Falls. And that had a huge amount of. What's that, sorry?
That rings a bell. I think you're right.
It had a huge amount of spray ice. So he was trying to get a combination of a spectre as a on an ice pick, and then he was talking about getting wings on the end of it. And to me, that actually sounded remarkably similar to what people have played with in Fiordland, which is cutting snow stakes down. But I think really that type of protection comes back into the do not fall category, that it's really what that aerated stuff or how well that is attached. You might be able to get some resistance through that medium, but how well is it attached to what's underneath? Is that a sort of wet granite slab in Fiordland, in which case the top may just shear off.
That sounds frightening. So Tom asks, would you be happy wrapping off a V-thread made using perhaps a shorter ice screw, like not necessarily the big long green bad boy, and say you don't have 22 centimeters of ice to play with, What are you doing in that situation to get something bomber to abseil from?
Yeah, good question. So it depends a lot on the quality of the ice and then how well you think the ice is attached to the surroundings. So maybe you had a piece of ice that's maybe 15 or 16 centimetres thick, but was extremely well attached to the surrounding area, then a shorter V-thread might be good. Or if it's some glacier ice, and you've got some glacier ice, then shorter could be okay. I guess if there's doubt, you could link two together. So drill one, maybe a metre apart, drill another, link them with a sling, and then back them up, like your idea of the screamer. So perhaps back that up with a screamer, and then get the heaviest person to rappel first. That would be the kind of the strategy I'm using. Steve House talked about wrapping off a V-thread drilled with a 10 centimetre stubby. So I guess maybe I'm not going to go climbing with Steve House.
Yeah, sounds a bit sketchy. There is, there are a few videos, of course, on the internet of people like hacking away at V-threads, and it's not till like they get down to the last itty bit they break. But like the difference with that though is that, by having a long screw, you've got it into the really good deep ice. Whereas if you're just using a stubby, you're probably only using the surface crud, and maybe you've hacked it away. But it's yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure Steve House spent a lot of time searching for that ice.
Yeah.
I guess that the question is there a better option?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's probably the first question. So Murray asks, what's the point of racking everything on one side? He noticed you've got everything on one side of your harness.
Well, I guess yeah, exactly. I'm right-handed, so I can demonstrate better with my right hand. I definitely have the other side full as well. And it's a good point. You want to try and be as ambidextrous as you can. Mm-hmm. So really that's just for demonstration purposes. Murray might have noticed that I only had 5 screws. So it's either a short eye screw or I'm going to be running that out a lot.
Yeah. I think he might be tongue-in-cheek. I would like to know the difference between an A thread and a V thread. Is that just terminology, or are they the same thing?
Yeah, in some ways it's terminology. So the idea, from what I've heard, is A threads are you're actually threading the rope itself through the holes, but the pattern that you're drilling is the same. But it seems like a jargon issue. Obviously, if you're threading the rope through the holes itself, the ice must be completely dry, because if there's any free water and the air's cold, it'll go into the hole and you'll just freeze your rope in the hole. And then you're going to have to be climbing on some pretty skinny ropes, because in my experience, it's actually surprisingly hard to pull down ropes in the ice environment. Just a little bit of sort of wet, sticky ice creates a huge amount of friction. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of terminology, a lot of jargon about different types of drilled hold anchors.
I think just practicing, right? Like at ground level, find a nice bit of ice and practice with it and get real good. That's probably the best way to get familiar with these things, because then if you practice it and you're like just relaxed, it's going to be a lot easier to do it in Ango and you're at the top of a route and you're like really tired and pumped or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right. So I haven't seen any more questions come through in the last couple of minutes, but I just want to ask you one, which is, where's your favourite place to go ice climbing in the world?
Oh, I'd have to say Canada, really. I mean, Canada's got to be the chocolate box of ice climbing. I remember the Canadian guidebook said there's enough ice routes up the Banff Jasper Highway that you're doing well not to crash your car. We definitely had to have the rule that you had to stop the car to have a look because people driving would sort of lose focus, perhaps. So I think, if you could pick a place, Canada would have to be it. Europe definitely has quality routes, but the population means there's a lot more scarcity. You've got issues with crowds.
And being like trodden on by guides and stuff over there. Yeah, I was pleased you said Canada because if anyone happens to have, it's not going to show up. There we go. Climber, gosh, it's not working with my green screen thing. Summer 2018, 2019, there is a fabulous instructional article with a bunch of data about ice climbing trips in Canada. So COVID willing, we'll be able to go back there in the future. But is there anything else you'd like to impart upon the audience? Anything you might have forgotten, or happy to leave it there for the evening?
I guess if you're really motivated about ice, the real inspiring mentor was somebody like Mick Fowler, who lived in London, but somehow tried to Scotland and be on new routes before the locals had managed to realise that they had formed and would be walking up actually to attempt them and witness him on the crux. And so, Mick Fowler was obviously obsessed, but really trying to get your head into the environment that you want to be in. So getting out, maybe when the conditions aren't good, into the mountains to test out your equipment, to experience the cold, to kind of get you and your partner used to those kind of early starts and looking at the terrain before there's a lot of snow or a lot of ice so that you kind of have got a feel of what the place is like is probably quite helpful rather than waiting until you hear on a forum that things are really good. And then you've got all those challenges of getting to the route at the time that you want to be there. All that sort of stuff you might have ironed out, and built a bit of sort of stoke with your partner and excitement about the season ahead is really important.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks very much, Tim. And just to let, I guess, people in the audience know about ways in which they can get into the ice climbing. I guess there's taking a specific course or doing a trip with a guide such as yourself. There's NZAC's Leading on Technical Ice course, which happens usually every year. This year, I guess we'll see. Probably not. And then there's the Remarkables Ice and Mix Festivals, sort of very short, almost taster kind of weekend course. But yeah, just like to say thanks very much for sharing your wisdom with us. It's been a great talk and really high quality advice, I think, for all the budding ice climbers out there. So thanks very much, Tim. Cheers.
Thanks, cheers.
Good one. All right, well, we're going to wrap things up just after a few NZAC announcements. Now I'd just like to say thanks again for having tuned into this, the sixth and final NZAC Virtual Club Night. And just to go through the announcements we had at the start of the talk, if you are interested in becoming the Alpine Club's next president or the president-elect, nominations for that prestigious role close on the 5th of June. It's a very important role, obviously, for the New Zealand Alpine Club, which is still very much a volunteer organisation in many ways. And all the information about the president-elect position and voting and nominations and all that kind of stuff is available on the Alpine Club website. And you'll be aware that the current president, Lindsay's not exactly having an amazing run of it because the Alpine Club obviously is in some trouble because of the massive financial impact that the coronavirus has had. And you'll have seen that in your email inbox last week. And just like to say thanks again to all the kind members who've helped us out in tough times and have contributed donations to the Alpine Club's general fund. And donations of any size are willingly accepted and will help to fund the core business of the Alpine Club and keep things going, essentially, which is dire. And in a small way that you can contribute, We've got our weekly book deals attached to these talks that we've been running. From last week's talk by Angie Scarth-Johnson, we've had North Island Rock Deluxe on sale for $35. That deal closes this evening. So if you're a North Island rock climber or even a South Island rock climber with plans to go north, that is the definitive guidebook for the North Island, and $35 is basically a steal. So that's available on the Alpine Club website, along with this week's book offer, the Queenstown Rock Ice and Boulders Guidebook, available for just $30. And encourage you to get on there. All the other items on the Alpine Club website are, of course, available now that we're back to level 2 and being posted out promptly by the team at Home Mountaineering. This is us NZAC virtual club night for at least it's planned for the foreseeable future. So just like to say thanks again to our speakers. We've had Lindsay and Riley Smith, Nick Allen, Anna Keeling, Graham Zimmerman, Angie Scarth-Johnson, and of course tonight Tim Robertson. Just like to thank them all for giving up their evenings and giving us some really outstanding talks and some good inspiration when we haven't been able to go into the hills. But for now, of course, with COVID level 2, we can go back into the hills. And I look forward to seeing you out there and to say thanks very much again for tuning into tonight's NZAC talk. And we look forward to seeing you at meetings and seeing you on the hills very soon. Thanks again.